The year was 1871, and the hill above Danvers wore the hospital like a crown made of stone and misgivings. From the road, the building appeared orderly, Gothic spires, arched windows, a facade that pretended to be merciful. But those who worked inside knew its temperament. A place where clocks seemed to tick louder after midnight and footsteps never felt alone. They brought the camera into the East Wing that morning, a Thursday, because Thursday mornings were when Catherine was calmest. James Thornton, whose trade was to fix human faces inside rectangles of glass, set down his wooden case and took in the cell with a professional's glance. One barred window, an iron bed with a thin mattress, small table, a chair, a bucket discreetly abandoned to the corner. He'd photographed politicians, hysterics, consumptives, and soldiers who had returned from the war too quiet to be called alive. But no room had carried the air this one carried, like the inside of a church just after a congregation has left, when the echo of prayer still lingers without the people who made it. Catherine sat in the chair, as if she'd been waiting for them all along. 9 years old by parish record, small, wiry, the simplest gray hospital dress. Her hands were folded, knuckles pale as unlit wax. She did not fidget, did not blink too often, did not ask questions that children ask when machines arrive. She merely regarded the incomer, the box, the lens, the bellows, the man behind it, with what Dr. Elias Hartwell would later write down as evaluative regard. Thornton would choose a different phrase that night in his own notebook. She looked as though she had already seen the result. The doctor and the photographer had met in the superintendent's office an hour earlier to settle procedure. They agreed on 3 plates, a straightforward portrait, a 3/4, and a second frontal to test consistency. Exposure time would be long, 15 seconds, because the light had a winter thinness even in June, and the emulsion did not forgive haste. Between them, they carried the solemnity of men who think that if they can only hold reality still long enough, it might confess its secrets. Thornton placed the tripod. The floor creaked once, just once, as he leveled the legs and checked the spirit bubble, a green bead steadying itself like a heartbeat. He unfolded the bellows, drew the lens panel forward, locked the rise and the tilt. He draped the black cloth, his favorite cloth, ribboned with an old chemical stain like a pale river, across the camera back and his own shoulders, then peered into the ground glass where the world appeared reversed and dim. There she was, upside down, shrinking and blinking at a fraction of herself, and yet somehow more present in the glass than in the room. He made a small adjustment. The upside-down child did not waver. "Miss Doyle," Hartwell said, his voice deliberately plain as if speaking to the weather. "We will be very quick." Catherine inclined her head, a gesture tidy as a period at the end of a sentence. The plate, collodion poured. Silver nitrate bath done, came out of the portable case gleaming and near invisible, like a secret laid on a piece of night. Thornton slid it into the holder with the practiced care of a man who has learned that all disasters arrive disguised as minor impatiences. He checked the shutter. He breathed once evenly. The room exhaled old stone and carbolic. "Look here," he said from behind the lens, tapping the brass rim gently. "Just here." Catherine's eyes rose and met the darkness at the center of the glass. Thornton later swore that the first sensation was entirely physical, like walking into a cellar and finding the air a shade too cold for the season. In his memory, a draft crept under the cuffs of his sleeves and climbed to his elbows, where it took up residence. The second sensation was the stranger, the feeling, not metaphorical, not dramatic but precise, that the corridor behind him had subtly lengthened, though he knew with a carpenter's certainty that the hospital's hallways never granted more space than they stole. He drew the dark slide. "Hold," he said. The shutter opened with a soft, confident click. 15 seconds made a long moment. The silence felt measured, 5, 6, 7, and the child did not tremble. There was no tremor in the bellows, no mischief in the light, no nurse coughing at an unlucky second to ruin exposure. 11, 12, 13. The seconds were coins he stacked on an invisible counter. He closed the shutter and felt, inexplicably, as if something had closed behind him as well. Plate secured. He took the holder to the makeshift darkroom, an empty medication closet requisitioned for chemistry. its shelves newly stripped of bottles and newly lined with thick black cloth. Hartwell did not accompany him at once. The doctor stayed in the doorway to the cell, watching the girl who watched nothing and everything. He had learned that some facts came only when he took no notes at all. Under the ruby glow and the smell of ether that clung to old wood like a memory, Thornton began the sequence he could have done blindfolded. Developer across the plate, a steady, even pour, tilting the tray so liquid lapped and smoothed and lapped again. A coastline of chemistry, watching for the first surfacing of an image. He'd seen faces emerge 1,000 times, the shy birth of a mouth, the cautious arrival of eyes from a gray sea, a forehead finding itself among tones. This time the plate resisted, then yielded in bursts. The forehead came up too quickly, the cheeks lagging behind. The background bloomed, then retreated. He frowned. Mayflies of irregular grain danced and died. He tilted, adjusted, coaxed, careful not to overdevelop and drown what was trying to be born. Then the eyes arrived. He had trained himself, through war and ward, not to humanize glass. A plate is a plate. A face is a face shaped by light and mathematics and silver. But he felt it anyway, that reflex of stepping back as if from a sudden edge. The eyes were not bright. They were not theatrically dark. They were not unusual in size or shape. Their strangeness lay in the illusion of depth, as though light had refused to bounce and had instead gone on traveling, down and inward, to spaces the emulsion could somehow report, but the mind could not chart. He blinked, and in that blink, half a heartbeat, a fraction of fraction, the sensation came that the plate had looked back. When Hartwell joined him, the image was fixed and rising toward clarity in the hypo. The doctor did not speak. His spectacles, which did not magnify so much as comfort him, caught a little fog that he did not wipe away. The mouth in the photograph was settled into a neutrality that Hartwell recognized and distrusted. In his notes, he called it an expression between expressions. The shoulders were held with the same neat precision he had seen so often in the girl's stillness, but the outline of her dress appeared edged by a softness that had not been present in the room, like a faint, inconsistent aura of light that chose where to be. Artifacts? Hartwell asked finally, more to hear a normal word than to accuse the plate. Irregular, but not impossible, Thornton said, though he meant, I do not know. We'll run controls. Same lens case, same room, same hour, different subject. They made 2 more plates of the girl, and the second frontal was the most unsettling. The geometry of the room was wrong at the margins. A dark vertical where there had been nothing like a column appeared behind her left shoulder, a shadow too definite to be shadow and too vague to be anything else. On the third plate, the vertical vanished and the wall recovered its usual humility. Thornton busied himself with practicalities, washing, marking, setting out glass to dry, because he knew the defense of a craftsman is the craft itself. Hartwell dated and signed the backs with a meticulous hand. He underlined the time, June 15, 1871, 10:18 a.m. Word ran ahead of policy, as it always did in hospitals. By afternoon, 3 senior physicians stood awkwardly in the cramped dark room doorway, each pretending they were merely passing, each peering longer than politeness advised. One shook his head and said nothing. Another remarked on the peculiar density curve, like a man invoking Latin against weather. Sister Margaret looked once and then blessed herself quickly, murmuring a prayer so soft that even the prayer seemed shy of the air. Fatigue illusion, said Dr. William Foster in the tone of a man who liked the world best when it yielded to labels. Eyes accommodate to points of contrast near the center of the plate. Residual developer along the edge drifted during tray agitation. Nothing more. They made the control plates at once to indulge him. An orderly sat in Catherine's chair, bemused and compliant. The lens did not shiver. The wall did not invent architecture for itself. The exposure held its ordinary burden and surrendered an ordinary face. Foster cleared his throat and discovered he had nothing to add to the noises people make when their first words have been disarmed. That evening, Hartwell took one of the plates to his office and leaned it on a stack of case notes, as if propping a window ajar. He intended to write. He intended to ensure that facts remained facts, the thread of procedure unbroken, the sequence of events stable enough to survive tomorrow's doubts. But the narrative would not line up. Date, hour, equipment, witness list, neat. The rest, less so. He lifted the plate and held it near the lamp only long enough to confirm what the lamplight tried to do to it. In flame, the eyes seemed deeper, not brighter. He set the glass down and adjusted the wick lower, then lower still, until the room entered that shore between gloom and usefulness, where paper remembers forests and ink feels heavier. On his way back to the east wing, he stopped outside Catherine's door. He did not enter. He had learned the cost of too much proximity. Through the tiny window inset in the iron, he saw her in profile, sitting as she had sat for the camera, composed as a drawn bow not yet loosed. She did not look at the door. She did not need to. He felt, as he always felt near her, the peculiar doubling of himself, doctor and boy, skeptic and witness, standing side by side, neither certain which one would write the report. The night nurse would later swear that the corridor felt colder for an hour after the plates had dried. Another would mention a smell, barely there, like struck flint or summer air just before lightning. The janitor, a man whose opinions were rarely recorded, told no one that he had walked past the dark room and paused because he thought for a breath. He heard a second set of footsteps following his own, that stopped when he stopped and never resumed. On the morning of the 16th, Thornton returned with a box, cotton-lined. For the transport of the plates to his studio, he handled them as if they were sleeping animals. "I'll make album and prints," he told Hartwell, "and keep the plates stored with the others." He meant, "I will not leave them here any longer than duty insists." Hartwell thanked him with a scientist's gratitude and a man's relief. By week's end, the first print lay on the superintendent's desk, matte and quiet and stubborn. Nurses came in pairs to see it and pretended they had errands in common. One office clerk looked twice, and then rearranged the papers on the desk with a concentration that attempted to exorcise the feeling that the photograph had rearranged her instead. The rumor, which had no author and no beginning anyone could name, said that if you stared into the child's eyes for more than a count of 12, you would dream of a hallway whose end kept moving away from you, though you were walking fast. Hartwell did not repeat the rumor. He recorded times, temperatures, procedures, reactions. He circled patient mood, calm, and underlined no agitation during exposure. He wrote one sentence he did not show to anyone. The plate does not depict. It participates. He crossed it out and replaced it with something methodical, something unafraid of committees. In the ledger that held the hospital's purchases and repairs, someone no one ever confessed entered a small, unnecessary requisition. 1 new thermometer for East Wing, 3rd floor. The old one, it was said, had become unreliable after the 15th. It read a degree or two too low when left on the table near the child's chair. Instruments do not take sides, Hartwell would have told you, but sometimes he knew now they take on habits. A photograph is not a person. It has no pulse, no breath, no appetite for soup. Yet in the weeks that followed, the paper rectangle behaved like a strange new window, installed in the hospital's memory. Men and women who prided themselves on rational stamina found themselves glancing away from it a little sooner than pride allowed. Others, fewer, steadier, looked longer and came away with a sentence they would not say out loud. Something in there understands me, and I would prefer it did not. So the chapter began, on glass, in silver, with a long exposure that felt longer than it was. Nobody called it a miracle. Nobody dared call it a trick. They called it a document, because that was what men like Hartwell and Thornton could bear to carry in their hands. But even as they labeled and filed and scheduled, the hospital had already been obliged to admit a different kind of record, that there are moments when seeing becomes an event in the room, and the room remembers. Katherine did not speak of the plates. When asked how she felt about the camera, she answered with a politeness so clean it left no fingerprints. "It was interesting," she said once, then added, as if remarking on the weather, "You saw what you could." It was the you that Hartwell noted, personal, precise, like a small pin pressed into a large map to mark where you think you are, though the map itself remains unfinished. The image would travel to offices, to parlors, to universities where men measured nerves and debated souls, and it would carry with it the singular insistence of the day it was made. That a girl of 9 could sit perfectly still and make a machine honest enough to tell the truth, and not nearly brave enough to explain it. And long after the handler's fingerprints had disappeared from the mount, long after the paper had acquired that faint vanilla smell of old albumin, people would look into those eyes and discover a new and unwelcome scale for time. 15 seconds, it turned out, was sufficient to outlast a century. Boston, 1860s. The harbor smelled of salt, coal smoke, and survival. Ships groaned against the wooden docks, their ropes soaked in seawater and sweat. Amid the noise of laborers unloading barrels and crates from distant continents, a man named Patrick Doyle earned his living one back-breaking shift at a time. Patrick was an Irishman, broad-shouldered but prematurely aged by the Atlantic wind. He had crossed that same ocean years before, carrying nothing but a rosary, a pocket Bible, and a promise to his wife, Mary, that in America they would never know famine again. Together they found shelter in the north end of Boston, where tenements stood shoulder to shoulder like beggars lining up for mercy. Their home was a narrow 2-room apartment on Endicott Street. One window, a rusted stove, and a ceiling low enough that Patrick could touch it without stretching. Yet within those cramped walls, the Doyles built a small kingdom of routine and faith. Mary Doyle, soft-voiced and sharp-eyed, worked as a domestic servant in the mansions of Beacon Hill, scrubbing marble floors that shone like mirrors and polishing silverware that would never belong to her. She often returned home late, her apron still smelling faintly of the perfumes of rich women who never learned her name. And yet, every evening she brought leftover bread wrapped in a cloth, lit a single candle and whispered, "It's enough." That candle was often the only light their daughter Catherine read by. The light of the house, Katherine Doyle, was born on March 15, 1862, the same night her father claimed to have heard church bells ringing, even though no mass was scheduled. Her mother would later say that Catherine came into the world quiet, as if listening before crying. She was their only child, small for her age but sturdy in spirit. In the first years of her life, she knew laughter easily. She would sit by the window tracing ships' masts with her finger, naming each one as though she could remember their destinations. That one goes to Ireland. That one brings sugar. That one will come back in spring. Patrick adored her. He called her "my little Boston star," and on Sundays, after Mass at St. Leonard's Church, he would lift her onto his shoulders so she could see the whole congregation. Mary would laugh, pretending to scold them both. "Patrick, the priest will think we're showing off our miracle." By every account, family letters, parish notes, school records, Catherine's early years were perfectly normal. She was affectionate, curious, and obedient. She helped her mother sweep the floor, folded laundry with tiny hands, and learned her catechism faster than most girls her age. Neighbors remembered her carrying a worn rag doll with button eyes, whispering secrets to it in a mix of English and the Gaelic her grandmother had taught her. In the evenings, when gas lights flickered on the streets outside, Mary would tell old Irish tales of banshees, saints, and travelers lost in fog. Catherine would listen wide-eyed, sometimes asking questions far too perceptive for her age. "Do you think," she once asked, "the dead can still see the living?" Her mother had laughed gently. "Only through our prayers, darling." A neighborhood of shadows and saints, the North End in the 1860s was a world of contrasts. Cobblestone alleys, laughter echoing from pubs, and the muffled cries of hungry children. Irish immigrants filled every tenement room, bound by faith in the shared ache of exile. Men worked the docks, women worked the houses, children worked at pretending not to notice. At night, the sound of the sea mixed with the sound of church bells and drunken songs. Yet amid that noise, the Doyle apartment was an island of calm. Patrick prayed before every meal. Mary read from the Psalms, and Catherine, bright-eyed and curious, repeated her father's prayers in Latin, not because she understood them, but because she liked the way the words felt. In those years, America was still nursing its wounds from the Civil War. Soldiers with missing limbs begged near the port. Newspapers sold for a penny shouted about Reconstruction and rebellion. But for immigrant families like the Doyles, the war had always been far away, a rumor in a foreign tongue. Their own battle was against hunger and rent, school and the sacred routine. At St. Leonard's parochial school, Catherine's teachers described her as attentive, Though shy, she wasn't exceptional, not in arithmetic, not in reading, but her handwriting was neat and she never caused trouble. Her best friend was another Irish girl named Bridget Malloy, who would later tell a church investigator that Katherine liked to stare at the clouds too long, as if reading something on them. During catechism class, the nuns would ask each student to recite a verse from memory. Katherine always chose the longest ones. "Because God hides secrets in long words," she once explained. Her mind was normal, her laughter unguarded, her sleep undisturbed. Every evening she would kneel beside her mother, hands clasped, and whisper the same prayer, "Lord, make me good and make me strong, and make me love you always." And Mary, wiping her hands on her apron, would respond softly, "And keep you safe, my little girl." There was no darkness then, not yet. The ordinary years before the extraordinary family accounts from those years describe a simple rhythm. Mary's soft singing at dawn, Patrick's cough from coal dust, Katherine's humming of hymns as she brushed her doll's hair. Sundays were sacred. The family walked to the harbor after church, bought a loaf of sweet bread if coins allowed, and fed crumbs to the gulls. Neighbors would sometimes visit. A retired sailor named Mr. Grady told ghost stories from his voyages. One evening, when he described the calm sea before a storm that never ends, Katherine grew unusually quiet. She stared at him and said, "The sea remembers everyone who's fallen into it." The old man laughed it off. "What makes you say that, lass?" But she only smiled and looked away. Little things like that happened from time to time, small remarks that felt older than she was, yet they were dismissed as a child's imagination. Nothing more. The calm before the shift in. The spring of 1869, Mary fell ill with a fever that kept her in bed for weeks. Katherine would bring her cool water, sing softly, and refuse to leave her side. Patrick later said it was during those long nights that something in his daughter began to change. Not visibly. She still laughed, still helped, but he sensed in her eyes a kind of attentiveness, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. Once, late at night, he caught her standing by the window, staring at the harbor. "What are you doing awake, Katie?" he whispered. She turned to him with that calm, innocent tone. "I was listening for the bells." "There are no bells tonight," he said. "I know," she replied. "But sometimes they ring for me anyway." He told Mary the next morning, and they both laughed. The kind of laugh couples use to keep fear small. The fever passed. Mary recovered. Life resumed its rhythm, but the moment had already marked the beginning of an invisible crack. The day before the storm by late summer 1869, the Doyles' life seemed, on the surface, perfect. Katherine was healthy, cheerful, and preparing to start another year at the parish school. Patrick was saving a little each week for a proper wooden dollhouse he had seen in a shop window. Mary, grateful for the return of her strength, decided they would celebrate Katherine's 7th birthday with a cake, their first homemade one in years. On September 13th, 1869, they sat together after dinner, the candle flickering low. Mary later told doctors that she remembered every detail. Katherine helping her mother wash the dishes, Patrick reading aloud from the Boston Herald, the quiet laughter that filled their tiny kitchen. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing foretold what would come the next morning. Katherine went to bed early, the rag doll tucked under her arm, her lips moving in the faint rhythm of a prayer. Patrick checked on her twice, as he always did. At dawn, the light through the thin curtains fell across her small bed, her hair tangled in the pillow's crease. She did not stir when her mother entered. When she did finally open her eyes, there was something new behind them, something older than memory, and that was the morning Mary Doyle would later call the day I lost my daughter. September 14th, 1869. The morning began without thunder, without omen, only the pale Boston light crawling through threadbare curtains. Mary Doyle woke first, as always, to the faint hum of the harbor. The smell of salt and chimney smoke seeped through the window. She stirred the ashes in the stove, poured a little water into the tin kettle, and called softly toward the small bedroom. "Katherine, time to wake, darling. We'll be late for Mass." No answer. Usually her daughter would already be awake, humming the morning hymn she liked, or sitting on the edge of her bed, brushing the hair of her rag doll. But this morning silence hung like dust. Mary pushed open the door. The room looked as it always did. The doll, the wool blanket, the faint pattern of sunlight on the wall, but the girl lying there seemed slightly apart from all of it, as though her body had been placed carefully in a scene it no longer belonged to. Catherine's eyes were open, not wide, not frightened, simply open, fixed somewhere above her mother's shoulder. Seeing something that wasn't there. "Sweetheart," Mary whispered. Sitting on the edge of the bed, "Are you all right? You'll miss your breakfast." Katherine turned her head slowly. Her face was calm but wrong in ways that language couldn't yet hold. The warmth that usually softened her expression had drained away, leaving something precise and motionless. When she finally spoke, the sound startled Mary so deeply she dropped the kettle spoon she'd been holding. "Good morning, Mother," Katherine said. The words were ordinary, but the voice was not a child's. It carried a low, measured tone, the kind used by adults who choose every word like a key fitting a lock. There was no sing-song rhythm, no trace of the 7-year-old who used to giggle mid-sentence. Mary hesitated, smiling awkwardly. "Oh, listen to you, catching a cold maybe? You sound like Father O'Brien when he's tired." Katherine blinked once, then said, "I feel well. I just woke from a long dream." Patrick entered the room, adjusting his work coat, already late for the docks. "Up with you, Katie." The son's been waiting. The girl sat up. The movement was deliberate, unnervingly careful. She didn't rub her eyes or stretch her arms like children do after sleep. Instead, she folded her hands neatly in her lap and looked at her father. Not to him, but through him. "Where are you going today?" she asked. "The port," he said, smiling. "Where else?" "I think you'll find a broken crate near Dock 4, she murmured. "A man will slip on the wood and he'll cut his hand badly." Patrick chuckled, ruffling her hair. "You been dreaming of my work again, eh?" But she didn't smile. "No," she said quietly. "I saw it." Small signs, growing shadows, the day passed with small peculiarities that felt too minor to name. Katherine moved slower, as though thinking through each step before taking it. When she sat at the breakfast table, she didn't touch her bread. She traced shapes on the table with her fingertip, circles, triangles, symbols Mary didn't recognize. When asked what she was doing, she replied softly, "Making order where there was none." By noon, the neighbors came by, Mrs. Donnelly from next door and her little boy Thomas. The two children had been inseparable since infancy, inventing games in the narrow alley, chasing pigeons until dusk. But this time, when Thomas ran in with his toy ship and shouted, "Come play sailor, Katie," she only looked at him blankly. "I don't play those games anymore," she said. "Why not?" Thomas asked. "Because I've already seen how it ends." The boy frowned, then shrugged and left. Mrs. Donnelly whispered later that evening, "Your girl's acting queer, Mary. Like she's thinking too much." Mary forced a smile, but her stomach had already begun to twist. The first proof that afternoon, Patrick returned from the docks pale and unsettled. He tossed his cap on the table and poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. Mary, startled, asked what had happened. He hesitated, then said, "You remember what she said this morning about a man cutting his hand?" Mary nodded slowly. It happened. Exactly like that. Crate slipped, splintered, took a man's palm near clean open. Blood everywhere. "We thought he'd lose the hand if the doctor hadn't been near." Mary tried to laugh. "Coincidence," she said quickly, too quickly. Patrick nodded. "Aye, coincidence," he repeated. But neither of them believed it. That night, Katherine ate quietly, staring at the candle flame as if measuring its rhythm. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried that same calm gravity that frightened her parents more than shouting ever could. "Don't worry about the man, Father. He'll heal. He's not meant to die this week." Patrick's spoon froze midway to his mouth. Mary whispered, "Katie, who told you that?" Katherine turned her head and smiled faintly, a small curved line that didn't reach her eyes. "No one told me," she said. "I just know." A child with the knowledge of ages. In the weeks that followed, the transformation deepened. Katherine no longer played outside. Her laughter, once bright and spontaneous, became rare and mechanical, like something remembered rather than felt. She began to read endlessly, books from the parish library far beyond her grade level, scripture commentaries, old philosophical tracts, even Latin theological texts that most priests hadn't touched since seminary. When Father O'Brien visited the school, Sister Margaret told him, "The Doyle girl can quote Aristotle." "I swear it, Father," she said. "Nature abhors a vacuum," and explained it. The priest smiled, thinking the nun exaggerated, until Catherine herself approached him after class. "Father," she said politely, "I've been wondering, if the soul seeks perfection, why does God permit ignorance to exist?" He blinked. "Well, my dear, that's a question scholars debate for a lifetime." She tilted her head. "Then they must not be listening." That night, Father O'Brien wrote in his parish diary, "The Doyle child possesses a gravity unfit for her years. There is in her gaze a knowledge not taught by man nor meant for children, the secrets she shouldn't know." It was around this time that the whispers began in the neighborhood. Catherine had begun saying things, small things at first, then worse. One evening at supper with the O'Malleys, family friends, she suddenly looked up and said, "Mr. O'Malley, you shouldn't worry about the money hidden under your bed. Your wife already found it last week." The room fell silent. Mrs. O'Malley turned red. Patrick apologized, but the damage was done. Days later, Catherine told a neighbor that his brother's ship had sunk before the telegram arrived. She described the storm, the color of the sky, the sound of the ropes snapping, with eerie precision. When asked how she could possibly know, she shrugged. "Sometimes the world tells me things," she said. The Doyles stopped inviting neighbors over after that. The Fracture Mary's nights grew sleepless. She would wake to find her daughter sitting by the window, eyes open, face turned toward the harbor. "Go back to bed, Katie," she would whisper. "I can't," the girl would reply softly. "It's louder at night." "What is?" "The thinking." And Mary would stand there helpless, watching her only child sit perfectly still, not restless, not feverish, just listening to something no one else could hear. By October, the changes could no longer be dismissed as imagination. Catherine's drawings turned strange. She filled pages with spirals, circles, and intricate patterns that resembled star maps or mathematical diagrams far beyond her schooling. One night, Patrick found her whispering Latin phrases in her sleep. Not prayers, but long, complex passages from texts she had never seen. The next morning, when he asked what she had been dreaming of, she replied calmly, "I wasn't dreaming, Father. I was remembering." "Remembering what?" Her eyes met his, calm, dark, and endless. Before. The day ends by winter, the Doyles lived as if under a spell they couldn't name. The neighbors avoided their door. Priests whispered about possession. Doctors spoke of fevered imagination. But Mary and Patrick, loving, ordinary people, only knew that the child they tucked into bed one autumn night was not the one who woke up the next morning. And so the Doyle house on Endicott Street grew quiet. The laughter was gone. Only the ticking of the old clock remained, marking time like a metronome, counting the distance between the world they knew and the one their daughter had begun to enter. That distance would grow wider, darker and stranger with every passing day. Winter crept into Boston early that year. The harbor froze in uneven sheets, and smoke from the tenements hung low over the rooftops. The cold found its way into every crack of the Doyle apartment, and yet, strangely, Catherine never seemed to feel it. While other children shivered under layers of wool, she walked barefoot across the wooden floors, her breath visible, but her skin warm and pale, untouched by the season. "Aren't you cold, darling?" her mother asked one morning. Catherine looked at her with mild confusion, as if the word itself had lost meaning. "I don't feel what others feel," she said simply. Mary laughed nervously, tugging the shawl tighter around her daughter's shoulders. But Catherine let it fall away seconds later, a mind expanding beyond measure. By December 1869, Catherine's strange intellect had become impossible to ignore. She could read Latin fluently, and began quoting entire passages from the Book of Isaiah and Aristotle's Metaphysics. She debated with Father O'Brien about predestination and divine paradoxes with an authority that made the old priest uneasy. "You speak like a woman who has read for 50 years, he told her. "Once I have read," she replied. "Just not here." When asked what she meant, She smiled that new smile, small, deliberate, and ancient. At home, she began filling her notebooks with words and symbols no one could decipher. Part mathematical, part scriptural, part something else entirely. Patrick once flipped through a few pages and said, "Katie, this looks like nonsense." She took the notebook back without anger. "Then it's not meant for you, Father." The morbid fascination, the warmth of childhood faded from her voice, replaced by a calm interest in things that frightened even adults. She began asking questions about death. Not the kind a child asks, but the kind that an anatomist or executioner might. How long does it take before the light leaves a person's eyes? Which hurts more, drowning or burning? Do you think pain is part of God's design, or is it something older? Mary would cross herself whenever such words left her daughter's mouth. "Don't say things like that, Katie. You'll invite shadows into the house," Catherine would reply softly. The shadows were always here. You just didn't see them. Her drawings reflected this new obsession. Gone were the childish sketches of flowers and saints. Instead, her papers filled with figures in agony. Bodies bound, eyes closed, flames curling around their outlines. And yet each drawing was precise, almost artistic, as though she had studied anatomy firsthand. Dr. Morrison, the family's physician, would later write in his notes that Catherine drew with the confidence of a medical illustrator and the detachment of one who no longer distinguishes horror from beauty. The pain that wasn't pain in January 1870. The Doyles discovered that their daughter could endure pain in ways that defied explanation. It began one evening when Mary found blood on the bedsheets. Panicking, she rushed to her daughter's room and saw Catherine calmly scraping her arm with a broken piece of porcelain from a teacup. "Catherine, stop that!" she screamed, grabbing her hand. The girl looked up with mild irritation, not guilt. "I just wanted to see," she said. "See what?" Mary demanded, trembling. "What's beneath?" Catherine whispered. Patrick carried her to the doctor that night, but the wounds, though deep, healed with unnatural speed. Within days, there was no trace, no scarring, no tenderness. Worse still, she began seeking the pain. Sometimes she would press her hands against the hot stove just long enough for the skin to redden, then pull away, smiling faintly, whispering, "It reminds me that this body isn't mine." Dr. Morrison insisted she be kept under supervision at all times. But even when watched, she found ways. Small shards of glass, nails from the wall, anything sharp enough to draw blood. And each time she seemed peaceful while doing it. Not frenzied, not hysterical, just detached, as if performing an experiment that only she could understand. The animals knew first. The Doyles owned a small orange cat named Clove, a quiet creature that had slept at Catherine's feet since she was an infant. But after her transformation began, Clove refused to enter her room. The cat would hiss and arch its back whenever Catherine approached, eyes wide with primal fear. "Maybe she smells different now," Patrick said, trying to rationalize. But soon other animals reacted the same way. The neighbor's dog, usually friendly, growled whenever Catherine passed the gate. Birds that gathered on the windowsill suddenly avoided their house altogether. Once, when Mary asked her why even the animals seemed frightened, Catherine looked out the window at a stray dog barking at her and said quietly, "They know. They can see what you can't." Unnatural strength in February, another sign appeared. Strength no child should possess. During a moment of irritation, Catherine tried to move a chair out of her way and snapped its wooden leg clean off. Patrick stared at the broken piece in disbelief. The chair was oak, thick and solid, yet her small hands had splintered it as though it were paper. "Do you see this?" Patrick whispered to Mary later that night, showing her the break. No child could have done this. Soon after, strange marks began appearing around the house. Indentations on the kitchen table shaped like small fingers pressed into wood, scratches on the walls where she had touched them. Mary tried sanding one of the marks away, but it remained deep and permanent. Even her endurance defied nature. One night, Patrick awoke around 2 in the morning to find his daughter standing perfectly still in the parlor, facing the wall. He called her name. No answer. When he touched her shoulder, her skin felt icy cold, but she did not flinch. "How long have you been standing here?" he asked, voice shaking. "Since dinner," she replied softly, her eyes never leaving the wall. I wanted to see how long I could stay between moments. She had been standing there for 6 hours. No fatigue, no tremor the night in the snow. It was during the harsh February storm of 1870 that the final proof came. The proof that something entirely unnatural had taken root in their daughter. Patrick woke to a strange stillness in the house. The fire had gone out and the air was biting cold. He reached for his coat and noticed the small bed beside the stove was empty. "Katie," he called. No answer. He checked the kitchen, the hallway, every corner of the small apartment. The door to the backyard was open. Snow blew in across the threshold. Heart-pounding, Patrick stepped outside, and there she was. Katherine stood barefoot in the middle of the yard, dressed only in her thin white nightgown. The wind whipped her hair across her face. Snow clung to her eyelashes, but she didn't move. She stood with her arms outstretched, palms facing the sky, head tilted back, as if welcoming the blizzard. Patrick ran toward her, shouting her name. His boots sank into the snow, his breath burning in the cold air. "Katherine, you'll freeze to death." She turned slowly. Her eyes, once brown, once human, were now completely black. No iris, no white, only a depthless void reflecting the faint light of the moon. When she spoke, her voice didn't echo from her mouth alone. It seemed to come from the wind itself. "The stars are almost aligned, Father. When they meet, you'll understand that Katherine never existed. She was only preparation." Patrick stumbled backward, crossing himself. The wind roared louder, as if laughing through the trees. He pulled her into his arms, but her body was ice cold, colder than death, yet somehow still breathing. When he brought her inside, she looked up at him and whispered, "It's not over. It's only beginning." That night, Mary sobbed into her hands while Patrick sat by the fire, trembling. The child slept peacefully, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, the Doyles made their decision. Faith had failed them. Love had failed them. They would turn to science. They would take their daughter to the only place left that might still offer answers: Danvers State Hospital. March 1870. Boston was still locked in winter, its streets a gray tangle of melting snow and coal smoke. In the North End, rumors about the Doyle girl had begun to circulate, half whispered in taverns, half murmured during confessions. Some said she was possessed. Others claimed she was blessed, a miracle child who could speak in tongues. But those who had seen her eyes, those black, endless eyes, refused to speak at all. Patrick Doyle, once a proud man of reason and work, now walked the streets like a ghost himself. His skin had turned sallow from sleeplessness. His hands trembled when he prayed. Mary no longer left the house except for Sunday Mass, and even there people shifted away from her pew. The only person who had not yet turned away was Father Timothy O'Brien, parish priest of St. Leonard's Church, the man who had baptized Katherine years ago. He remembered her as a laughing child in a white gown, clutching a small rosary too big for her hand. He had blessed her forehead himself, never imagining that one day he would be called not to bless her, but to confront her. The priest's first visit, Father O'Brien, arrived at the Doyle home on a bitter evening in late March. Patrick met him at the door, his eyes swollen from fatigue. "Thank you for coming, Father," he whispered. "We don't know where else to turn." The priest entered and was immediately struck by the stillness of the place. The air felt dense, like a church after Mass, when the incense has settled but the prayers are still hovering. Katherine sat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, staring into the flames. She did not rise or speak when the priest entered. Mary whispered, "Katie, Father O'Brien is here to see you." The girl turned slowly. Her eyes, once the warm brown of her mother's, now seemed darker, not black, but deep enough to make you forget color altogether. "Good evening, Father," she said. "You've grown older." The priest froze. He hadn't seen her since she was 6, yet her tone, her calm, assessing tone, was that of someone speaking to an old acquaintance, not a child addressing her pastor. He forced a kind smile. "That happens to all of us, my dear, and you've grown wiser, I hear." "Wiser?" she repeated. "No, only closer." "Closer to what?" he asked gently. She looked back at the fire. "To what you've been praying to but don't really know. The words chilled him. "And what is that, Catherine?" The girl smiled faintly. "You wouldn't understand even if it told you itself." A test of faith determined not to be unsettled. Father O'Brien decided to question her on Scripture, the method the church sometimes used to test supposed possessions. "Catherine," he said, "can you recite the Lord's Prayer with me?" She nodded. He began, "Our Father, who art in heaven." She continued alongside him perfectly, her Latin pronunciation flawless. But halfway through she stopped and whispered something under her breath, a sound the priest didn't recognize. It wasn't Latin. It wasn't Greek. It was older. The syllables rolled like echoes through stone corridors. "What language is that?" Father O'Brien asked, voice trembling. Catherine tilted her head. "The one before your God learned how to speak." Father O'Brien crossed himself instinctively. "That's enough," he said. The girl laughed softly, a laugh not mocking, but knowing. Private confession after supper, Father O'Brien asked to speak with Catherine alone. Mary hesitated but agreed, clutching her rosary like a lifeline. When the door closed, the priest pulled a small silver crucifix from his pocket. The candlelight flickered against the metal. "Do you believe in God, Catherine?" he asked. She smiled. "Which one?" "There is only one," he replied firmly. Her gaze deepened. "Then you haven't looked closely enough." Father O'Brien felt a pressure behind his eyes, a headache blooming from nowhere. He pressed the crucifix tighter in his palm. "Tell me, child, what troubles you? What tempts you?" She leaned forward, voice almost a whisper. "Do you remember, Father, when you were 12? The field near Ballyduff, the girl you kissed before your first communion? Her name was—" He stumbled backward, his heart slamming in his chest. "Stop!" Catherine's smile widened. "You never confessed that one, did you? You told yourself it was innocent. But it wasn't the act, Father. It was the thought. And you enjoyed it." He dropped the crucifix. The metal hit the floor with a dull clink. "How do you know that?" he whispered. She looked down at the fallen cross. "Because they tell me things. About everyone. About you." The decision when Father O'Brien left the Doyle home that night, his face was pale as snow. He said only one sentence to Patrick before stepping into the street. "You must let me bring the rites." The next day, he returned with an elderly deacon named Brother Callahan, a man too old to frighten easily. They brought with them candles, holy water, a chalice, and the Ritual Romanum, the ancient book of exorcism prayers that even the Vatican seldom authorized without proof. Mary resisted at first, tears in her eyes. "She's only a child," she pleaded. "She's my baby." Father O'Brien laid a trembling hand on her shoulder. "Then let us free her." The exorcism, it was just after midnight when the ritual began. The wind howled through the chimney, making the small crucifix on the wall sway like a pendulum. Catherine sat in a chair in the center of the room, calm and composed. No restraints, no struggle. The priest began the prayers, "Exorcizo te, omnis immundus spiritus, in nomine Jesu Christi, exiab hac creatura Dei." The Latin flowed strong and rhythmic, echoing through the cramped walls. For a while, Catherine said nothing. Then slowly, she began to repeat his words, perfectly synchronized, syllable for syllable, but in a deeper tone. Her voice grew in resonance until it seemed two voices were speaking, his and hers, woven together like a mocking duet. Father O'Brien's voice faltered. "In the name of Christ, who commands you?" Catherine's eyes lifted to meet his, glimmering like wet coal. "You can't command what you don't understand," she said. Then she began to laugh. It wasn't a childish giggle. It was something layered, harmonic, as if several unseen mouths laughed through her at once. The sound filled the room, echoing off the walls, vibrating the candle flames until they bent sideways. Mary screamed. Patrick fell to his knees. Brother Callahan dropped the holy water and muttered a prayer too fast to follow. The laughter swelled, then stopped abruptly. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. Catherine looked at the priest and said calmly, "If you finish that prayer, Father, Your heart will stop." He froze. His hand shook. He felt his pulse suddenly quicken in his throat, pounding violently. Sweat trickled down his collar. He dropped the book. Katherine smiled again. "See? You already believe me." Then she went still. Her breathing returned to normal. Her eyes softened. For a fleeting moment, she looked like a frightened child again. "Please," she whispered, "make them stop talking." Mary rushed forward, clutching her daughter's face. "Who, Katie? Who's talking?" Katherine blinked, and the darkness returned to her eyes. "All of them," she said softly. "All the ones who never left. Aftermath, when the ritual ended, or rather when it collapsed. The candles had burned low, the crucifix had fallen, and the priest's voice was nearly gone. Father O'Brien sat by the door, face gray, hands trembling. "She's not possessed," he whispered finally. "Or if she is, it's not by anything the church has words for." He never attempted another exorcism in his life. In his private journal, discovered decades later, he wrote, "Her laughter was not mockery. It was recognition. She knew something that unmade the very shape of faith inside me. The turning point after that night, the Doyles' home was no longer a home." Mary's prayers became desperate murmurs. Patrick stopped sleeping entirely. They both avoided the child's gaze, terrified of what might look back. The parish whispered that Father O'Brien had failed. Others said he had saved himself by stopping when he did. Either way, he urged the Doyles to seek medical help. "Something of the mind," he said weakly. And so, faith gave way to science. Within a week, Patrick Doyle wrote to Dr. Henry Morrison, one of Boston's most respected physicians in the field of mental disorders. A man of method, not miracles. He would come to their home within days. And when he did, the strange story of Katherine Doyle would enter the cold, clinical pages of medical history, where faith, reason, and fear would all blur into one. Early spring of 1870 came to Boston gray and sullen. The snow had receded into filthy gutters, leaving the streets slick with coal dust and the memory of cold. Inside a narrow townhouse near the harbor, Dr. Henry Morrison arranged his instruments. A mahogany case of scalpels, tuning forks, and glass thermometers. A stack of new notebooks. And a mind sharpened by European training that still believed all mysteries were merely unanswered questions. He was a man of exact hours and balanced meals, famous for his insistence that madness is but misfired reason. When the letter from Patrick Doyle arrived, its ink smudged, its sentences broken by panic. Morrison had sighed and folded it into his coat pocket. He expected another case of hysteria or feverish imagination, but when he climbed the creaking stairs of the Doyle apartment 2 nights later, he stepped into something colder than any illness he had ever studied. The first examination, Mary met him at the door, pale from exhaustion. "She's quieter now," she whispered. "Too quiet." In the sitting room, Katherine was seated beside the stove, reading a small Latin prayer book upside down. When Morrison entered, she did not rise. She simply looked up, and for one fleeting second, the doctor forgot the 1,000 patients he had examined before. There was a quality in her stare, clinical and ancient at once, that made him feel like he was the specimen. "Good evening." "Miss Doyle," he said, forcing cheer into his voice. "You're a doctor," she replied evenly. "You want to measure me?" "Well, yes," he admitted. "That is my work." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Be careful what you measure, doctor." "Sometimes it measures back." He noted the remark without comment. He had met precocious children before. Imagination often disguised trauma. Yet as he listened to her pulse, he frowned. It was 48 beats per minute, steady as a metronome, too slow for a child. Her temperature read 93 degrees Fahrenheit, yet she showed no shivering, no pallor beyond the eerie translucence of her skin. The sessions over the next 2 weeks, Dr. Morrison conducted daily interviews and tests. He questioned her about history, mathematics, theology. She answered all of them and more. "Who signed the Treaty of Paris?" he asked. "Both worlds did," she said. "What worlds?" "The one you remember, and the one that remembers you." Her notebooks filled with strange drawings, geometries of spirals intersecting circles, annotated in Latin, Greek, and another alphabet Morrison could not identify. When he asked where she learned such symbols, she answered, "I never learned them. I just write what I see." He observed her during these sessions with the rigor of a scientist. Posture erect, breathing shallow but rhythmic, eyes dilating whenever she spoke of death or stars. Her handwriting changed from line to line, sometimes neat and childish, other times ornate like that of an elderly scholar. Phenomena in the room by the fourth session, Morrison's confidence began to erode. The temperature in his office dropped whenever Katherine sat for examination, 4 to 6 degrees lower than the adjoining hallway. He replaced the thermometer twice, convinced of error. The readings remained the same. Plants on his desk, 2 ferns he had kept alive for years, withered within days. He documented this carefully. Environmental anomaly not explained by ventilation, light, or moisture. Possible chemical interference, though none detected. More unsettling were the auditory events. When Katherine spoke for long periods, his brass instruments vibrated faintly, as if reacting to some frequency outside human range. Once his assistant claimed to hear whispers emanating from the glass jars of preserved organs lining the shelf. Morrison reprimanded him for superstition. But he too had heard something, a soft cadence, not words. More like the memory of sound. The doctor's doubt Morrison prided himself on logic. But Katherine's case began to fracture that armor. He wrote in his private notes he never intended for publication, "I find myself uncomfortable under her gaze." It is not fear precisely, but an inversion of the observer's privilege. She sees as though the mind's contents were laid bare between one heartbeat and the next. She would often interrupt his thoughts mid-sentence, answering questions he had not yet spoken aloud. "Do you believe in souls, doctor?" she asked one afternoon. "I study minds, not souls. That's what minds always say when they're afraid they'll be proven wrong." He felt his patience thinning. "Child, do you enjoy frightening people?" "I don't frighten anyone," she said softly. "I only remind them what they forgot." Her drawings became central to his study. She produced anatomical sketches of the human body with startling accuracy. Bones rendered in precise proportion, organs labeled in Latin. Yet she had never studied medicine. More disturbing were the faces hidden in the margins, half-formed, distorted, eyes watching from impossible angles. When he asked her who they were, she said, "They're the ones who want to come through. You keep calling them delusions, but they call you one too." He locked the drawings away after that. The night of the test, determined to find a rational cause, Morrison performed a simple experiment. He placed a metal crucifix, a wooden spoon, and a glass of water before her. "Choose one," he said, "and focus on it. Let's see if your strength or influence can move it." Katherine's gaze settled on the glass. For 10 silent seconds, nothing happened. Then, without touch, the surface rippled, not from vibration or draft, but as though something below had breathed against it. The doctor leaned forward, breath held. The ripples intensified, forming a single wave that sloshed against the rim and spilled onto the table. She smiled faintly. "Satisfied?" Morrison's pen slipped from his fingers. The doctor's report. He began writing formal documentation, 23 pages of careful observation, stripped of adjectives. He described her intelligence, her cold body temperature, her unblinking focus, her spontaneous linguistic ability, her impossible knowledge of private details. He avoided the word supernatural, choosing instead unknown neurological expression, possibly new classification of cognition. But privately, he wrote a separate note. Folded inside the report, there is intelligence here older than the girl. Whether it speaks through her or is becoming her, I cannot yet tell. The snow incident revisited one night, Morrison was summoned again. Patrick's voice on the messenger's breathless note said only, "Come at once." "She's outside again." When he arrived, the girl was standing barefoot in the snow-filled yard, eyes open, arms raised, the exact posture described in Patrick's earlier account. Around her, the snow was melting, a perfect circle of exposed ground in the middle of the frost. Morrison approached carefully. "Katherine, come inside. You'll freeze." She turned her head slowly. "I'm not cold." "You keep saying cold because you can't feel what's coming. What is coming? The understanding." When she blinked, her pupils dilated until only black remained. "You'll write about me," she said quietly. But you won't believe what you've written. Transition to the hospital. After that night, Morrison conceded defeat. He recommended institutional observation, not because he believed she was mad, but because the Doyle home could no longer contain whatever she had become. He spoke gently to the parents. At Danvers State Hospital, we can ensure her safety, and yours. It will only be for a study, perhaps a few months. Patrick hesitated. Mary broke first, tears streaming down her face. If it helps her, take her. On the morning of March 15, 1870, exactly her 8th birthday, Katherine was escorted to a horse-drawn carriage bound for Danvers. She wore a gray coat and held her rag doll by the arm. As the wheels began to turn, she looked out the window at the doctor walking beside the carriage. "You're going to try to photograph me," she said. Morrison blinked. "How would you know that?" She smiled faintly. "It's what you do to things you don't understand." That smile would follow him all the way to the hill above Danvers, where the great Gothic towers of the hospital rose like stone sentinels, waiting to test the limits of science itself. And there, beneath those towers, the investigation of Katherine Doyle would move from miracle to madness, one experiment at a time. The carriage reached Danvers State Hospital just after noon on March 15th, 1870. From the Valley Road, the institution loomed above the Massachusetts countryside, an endless fortress of brick and slate, its towers stabbing the gray sky like accusations. Locals called it the Castle on the Hill. For miles around, its name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear. Built to house the curable insane, Danvers had become a monument to human uncertainty, part hospital, part prison, part cathedral of suffering. Inside its echoing halls, the line between treatment and torment had long since blurred. As the gates opened, Dr. Henry Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Beside him sat the child who had shattered his certainties, Katherine Doyle, freshly 8 years old, silent and self-contained. She gazed out the window not with curiosity, but with recognition, as though the massive building had been waiting for her all along. Arrival at the hospital entrance. Superintendent Dr. Elias Hartwell awaited them. A tall man in his 50s with the posture of a soldier and the eyes of a scholar, Hartwell had earned a reputation for both brilliance and obsession. He had studied under the pioneers of French psychiatry in Paris, and believed that with proper observation, even the most mysterious minds could be catalogued and understood. When Morrison introduced Katherine, Hartwell's skepticism was immediate. "A child with prophetic speech and abnormal physiology?" he murmured. "More likely suggestion and hysteria, the contagion of her parents' imagination." But when he met Katherine's eyes, the words seemed to die in his throat. The girl regarded him silently for several seconds, then said, "You shouldn't drink from the crystal decanter anymore. The lead will worsen your liver." Hartwell's jaw tightened. Few people knew about his secret evening ritual. One glass of sherry before bed, poured from that very decanter in his office. He said nothing, merely nodded to the attendants. "Prepare an observation room." The room in the East Wing Katherine's quarters were small but self-contained. An iron-framed bed, a wooden table, a narrow barred window overlooking the courtyard. The air smelled faintly of lime and disinfectant. A nurse named Sister Margaret O'Connell, a kindly Irish nun, was assigned to her care. At first she found Katherine polite, obedient, even gentle. But within days, the atmosphere in the children's ward began to shift. 3 other children, patients previously calm and responsive, started showing strange symptoms. They grew withdrawn, sitting for hours in silence. One girl stared endlessly at the corner of the room. A boy began humming the same 2-note pattern over and over, eyes unfocused. When Sister Margaret asked what they were doing, the children all gave the same answer in different words. "She's teaching us how to listen." The shadow woman then came the stories, whispered from bed to bed. The children claimed they saw a tall woman dressed in black walking the corridors at night. Her hair, they said, moved even when there was no wind. Her eyes were holes where the light goes in and never comes out. The staff dismissed it as hysteria. But one nurse fainted after finding the phrase, "The black woman watches," scratched into the wall of the playroom in 3 different handwritings, all belonging to children who could barely write their own names. Sister Margaret grew uneasy and went to Catherine. "Do you know who this woman is, child?" she asked. Catherine looked up from her drawing. "Yes, who is she then?" "She's what's left when prayers stop working." Isolation, Doctor. Hartwell, alarmed by the contagion of behavior, ordered that Catherine be moved from the children's ward to an isolation room in the East Wing. It was a stone cell, 3 meters by 4, bare except for an iron bed, a chair, and a table for notes. Catherine offered no resistance. She walked down the corridor calmly, her bare feet silent on the tile. The attendants later swore that as she passed, the gaslights flickered one by one, following her steps like a wave. From that day forward, Hartwell personally oversaw her observation. He began daily interviews, convinced that her condition was a case of pathological suggestion, a mind so powerful it could impose its delusions on others. Yet with every passing day, his confidence decayed. Conversations that unmade the doctor. Their sessions were supposed to be structured, questions, answers, behavioral assessment, but it was always Catherine who took control. "You've been watching me, Doctor," she said one morning. "Yes, Catherine. That's my duty." "And what have you learned?" "That you are a very unusual child." She smiled. "Then you've learned nothing." She asked him questions instead, questions that struck with surgical precision. "Why do you write more notes than you read? Do you think your work makes you immortal? Does she forgive you for what happened by the river when you were 12? Hartwell froze. The girl had named the memory he had buried, the drowning of a childhood friend, Sarah Mitchell, an accident that had haunted him for decades. How could you know that?" he stammered. Catherine's voice was gentle. "I don't know it. It remembers itself through you. The hospital changes, it wasn't only Hartwell who felt her influence. The entire East Wing began to change. Nurses complained of sudden headaches and nausea when near her room. 2 guards requested transfers after claiming they heard whispering voices coming from the walls. Temperature records showed that the East Wing was consistently 5 degrees colder than the rest of the hospital, even with the heating on full. Hartwell ordered thermometers replaced and pipes inspected. Nothing explained it. One orderly, driven by curiosity, left a small potted fern in Catherine's room. Within 3 days, the leaves had turned black and brittle. When asked if she had touched it, Catherine replied, no, it couldn't stand being seen. The experiments Hartwell, unable to reconcile these phenomena, turned to method. He began what he called the cognitive trials. He tested her memory. She recited entire pages from books she had seen once. He tested her reasoning. She solved puzzles meant for mathematicians. He showed her photographs of people long dead, asking for descriptions. She told him their names, occupations, and the dates of their deaths, all correct. Then came the predictive experiments. "Can you tell me what will happen tomorrow?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "What will happen? One of your patients will die. The man in room 14. His heart is tired of pretending." The next morning, the man in room 14 was found dead in his sleep. Hartwell's scientific notes grew increasingly desperate. Subject appears to demonstrate precognition with precision unaccountable by any known theory of psychology or coincidence. Yet the more he studied her, the more he sensed that it was studying him in return. The temperature phenomenon every night. When the lamps were extinguished, the thermometer outside her door began to drop. The nurses learned to dread the silence that followed, a heavy stillness like air before thunder. Once, Sister Margaret entered to check on her and found frost forming on the inside of the window, though it was midsummer. Catherine sat motionless on her bed, her eyes open, her breath slow and even. "Are you cold, my dear?" the nun whispered. Catherine blinked. "No, but you are." Sister Margaret ran from the room and refused to enter again for a week. The photograph by the summer of 1871. After 15 months of study, Dr. Hartwell made a decision that would change the case forever. He wanted proof, an image no skeptic could dismiss. He summoned James Thornton, a photographer known for his medical documentation of psychiatric patients. Thornton arrived with his cumbersome equipment, glass plates, tripods, and chemicals, expecting a routine session. When Catherine was brought into the room, she sat without instruction, hands folded neatly in her lap. Thornton adjusted the lens and instructed her to look directly into it. At the exact moment her eyes met the camera, both men felt it, a pressure in the air, a physical vibration that made their teeth ache. The temperature plummeted. Thornton's breath misted in front of him. He pressed the shutter. The exposure lasted 15 seconds. 15 seconds that felt like an eternity. When the plate was developed, silence filled the room. The photograph showed Katherine exactly as she had sat, but her eyes seemed alive. They followed the viewer, no matter the angle. Behind her, vague shapes emerged, indistinct forms like shadows that had not yet decided what to be. Thornton swore under oath that he had never seen such anomalies. Hartwell ordered control photographs taken in the same room, same conditions. Every one of them came out perfectly normal. The problem was not the camera. The problem was her. The staff's reaction. Within a week, copies of the photograph spread through the hospital's upper offices. Some doctors called it an optical illusion. Others refused to look at it twice. A young intern fainted after claiming the shadows in the picture had shifted when he wasn't looking. Another reported hearing faint whispers whenever he touched the glass plate. Hartwell wrote in his private diary that night, "I thought the camera would reveal her as she truly is." Instead, it revealed us. Small, frightened, and blind. The hospital begins to fracture after the photograph. Katherine's presence seemed to intensify. The air in the east wing grew colder still. Condensation formed on walls where no moisture existed. Patients began screaming at night, claiming to see the dark woman standing at the foot of their beds. Objects moved on their own. Doors opened without touch. And every time someone tried to explain it, something else happened. A clock stopping mid-tick, ink freezing in its well. A candle guttering with no breeze. Sister Margaret finally begged for transfer. Her resignation letter read only one line. "There is something in that room that is learning how to be more." Hartwell's breaking point. By late autumn, Hartwell's face had aged 10 years. He spent every night rereading his notes, trying to find a scientific foothold. But logic failed him. The hospital itself seemed to be bending around the girl's presence. He began to suspect that Danvers had not simply contained Katherine, it had awakened her. On the evening of November 1st, he entered her room for one final session. The air was icy. She was sitting upright in bed, wide awake. "Why are you doing this?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I'm not doing anything, doctor. I'm remembering." Remembering what? What it was like before there were walls. Hartwell stared at her in silence. "What are you?" he whispered. Katherine looked at him with calm, bottomless eyes. "I'm what happens when people try to understand what was never meant to be understood." The next morning, she slipped into a catatonic state that would last for weeks. Her breathing slowed, her pulse nearly vanished. But even in stillness, the temperature in her room remained below freezing. And the photograph, the one taken that summer morning, would soon leave Danvers and begin its journey into legend, studied by doctors, mystics, and scholars alike. To some, it was proof of possession. To others, proof of a mind beyond human comprehension. To Dr. Hartwell, it was simply proof that science had finally looked too far. Autumn, 1871. The air over the Massachusetts hills had turned sharp and metallic. Frost crept across the windows of Danvers State Hospital, tracing veins of silver through the glass. Inside the east wing, the corridor lights burned dimly, their glow distorted by the cold that never left Katherine Doyle's room. The photograph had been taken 3 months earlier. Since then, nothing had been the same. The silence. After the image, after that single click of the camera, something inside Katherine seemed to unravel. The laughter, the intellect, the endless energy, all began to collapse into silence. She no longer spoke in riddles or recited scripture. She only watched. Dr. Elias Hartwell recorded her decline with both fascination and despair. September 3rd, 1871. Subject appears to be deteriorating physically. Refuses food for days yet remains conscious. No sign of dehydration or organ failure. She is fading without dying. Her once glossy brown hair had turned jet black, thick and coarse as animal fur. Her skin grew translucent, almost luminous, as if lit from within. When the nurses entered, they swore they could see faint shadows moving beneath her skin, like the silhouettes of leaves shifting in a current. No fever, no disease, No diagnosis. Hartwell began to believe the photograph had changed something fundamental, as though the act of capturing her had taken a piece of her away. The long stillness by mid-September, Katherine began entering long states of rigidity. She would freeze in a sitting or lying position for hours, sometimes entire days, her eyes wide open but unmoving. She neither blinked nor breathed visibly, though her heart continued its slow, deliberate rhythm. During these episodes, the entire east wing grew colder. Frost formed on the floorboards. The air became heavy, muffled, soundless, as though the world itself held its breath. Staff who entered the room reported dizziness, nausea, and the overwhelming feeling that someone else was present, watching from behind their own eyes. Sister Margaret O'Connell, before her transfer, had called it the waiting state. No one knew what Katherine was waiting for. The voices one night. A nurse named Clara Redding heard whispers through the keyhole of Katherine's locked room. The voice was not the child's. It was deep, layered, harmonic, like several people speaking at once through the same throat. Clara pressed her ear to the door. "Not her time yet," the voice said. "She's still remembering. When the stars align, the mirror will open again." Clara fled down the hall screaming and refused to return. When Hartwell questioned Katherine the next morning, she only smiled faintly. "You shouldn't listen to doors, Doctor," she said. "They always tell you things you don't want to hear." The predictions, Katherine's last coherent words, came during one of Hartwell's morning examinations in early October. Her voice was quiet but steady. "3 will die before the leaves fall," she said. He thought it nonsense until within 2 weeks, 3 patients in the East Wing passed away under bizarre conditions. 1 from cardiac arrest, 1 from sudden fever, and 1 simply found lifeless in bed, body unmarked. Eyes open, Hartwell's rational mind fractured further. His notes from that week are erratic, ink smeared as though written with shaking hands. If consciousness can reach beyond time, then what boundary separates life from its own shadow? "I fear she has become a conduit for something larger than self." The Catatonia, by mid-October 1871, Katherine entered her final state, a catatonic paralysis lasting nearly 6 weeks. She did not eat, drink, or speak, yet remained alive. Her breathing was so faint that only a mirror held to her lips proved its existence. The doctors argued about how it was possible. Some claimed she was entering a form of suspended animation, others that she had transcended normal biological function entirely. But to those who stayed near her room, the experience was less clinical and more spiritual terror. Nurses reported hearing faint sobbing, though her lips never moved. Objects occasionally shifted on their own. Pencils rolling off tables. Curtains fluttering though the windows were sealed. One night, Dr. Morrison, who had traveled from Boston to observe her again, sat beside the bed and whispered, "Katherine, if you can hear me, what do you want?" Her eyelids flickered. Her mouth barely moved. "To stop remembering," she whispered. Then silence returned, total and endless. The death at dawn on November the 2nd, 1871. Katherine Doyle died. She did not convulse or gasp. She simply closed her eyes. For the first time in months, the temperature in the East Wing rose to normal levels. The frost melted. The silence broke with the sound of a single bird outside the window, a sparrow that hadn't been seen on the grounds in weeks. Dr. Hartwell stood by her bedside. Exhaustion etched into his face. He placed his hand on her wrist. "No pulse. Peace at last," he whispered. But even as he spoke, the mirror across the room cracked from corner to corner with a sound like distant thunder. The autopsy, Katherine's autopsy, took place that same afternoon, attended by Dr. Hartwell and a colleague from Boston University. Both expected to find some physical explanation, infection, cerebral swelling, congenital defect, anything. Instead, they found nothing. Her organs were perfect. Her heart was healthy, her lungs clear, her brain structurally sound, except for one anomaly. Regions in her temporal and frontal lobes showed advanced neural development, equivalent to that of an adult genius, while other regions remained childlike and undeveloped. Hartwell noted, "Her brain is an anachronism, a paradox of maturity and infancy coexisting in the same structure. Even more baffling, her body refused to decompose. Days after death with no preservation chemicals. Her skin remained smooth, her color lifelike. When her body was finally buried in the hospital cemetery, the earth above her grave stayed frozen for weeks despite mild weather. Plants refused to grow there. The photograph lives on. The photograph, the one that had captured her in that gray dress, with those impossible eyes, became a relic of fascination. Scholars, doctors, and spiritualists begged to study it. Wherever it went, unease followed. Some claimed to hear faint whispering if they stared at it long enough. Others said the shadows in the background shifted slightly when the room grew dark. Hartwell kept the original glass plate locked in his office for years. One night, in 1875, a janitor found him sitting before it, pale and trembling. "She's not gone," he said quietly. The image remembers her, the legacy doctor. Hartwell continued his research until his death in 1888. His final paper, The Doyle Anomaly, became a cornerstone of early psychiatry, cited for its methodical observation despite its horrifying implications. He never claimed supernatural cause, but his closing paragraph betrayed uncertainty. There exists a region of human consciousness that may intersect with phenomena we cannot yet quantify. The case of Katherine Doyle demonstrates that some boundaries, once crossed, refuse to close. Echoes across time 50 years later. In 1923, a young Swiss psychologist named Carl Jung examined the case and the photograph. He wrote that Katherine might have represented a living embodiment of synchronicity, a point where the inner and outer worlds merged into one visible pattern. He concluded, perhaps she was not ahead of her time, but outside it. Modern neuroscientists still review the surviving documents. Some propose temporal lobe epilepsy, others extreme savant syndrome, others still psychogenic manifestation, but none can explain the environmental phenomena, the temperature shifts or the photographic anomalies. In every theory, something remains unaccounted for, something beyond the vocabulary of science. The grave today, the old Danvers Hospital, no longer stands. It was demolished decades ago, the grounds converted into housing, but in a small corner of the old cemetery, a single worn stone remains. Katherine Doyle, 1862-1871. The light remembers. Locals say that on cold November mornings, frost still gathers over that grave first, even before dawn touches the others. And if you listen closely, you can sometimes hear the faint hum of a child's voice beneath the wind. Not crying, not laughing, just remembering Epilogue, the unfinished argument Katherine Doyle's story has outlived the doctors. The priests and the walls that once contained her, her name lingers not as a ghost story, but as a question no discipline can answer. What happens when the human mind looks too far into the dark and the dark looks back? To this day, the photograph remains locked in the archives of a Boston medical museum. Rarely displayed, never digitized, those who have seen it claim her eyes still follow you, not like a trick of light, but with intent, as though she recognizes you across time. They say if you look long enough, your reflection begins to fade, and in that fading, something else begins to remember you.